A 9-year-old girl had so much head lice that she passed away. On March 22nd of 2022, police in Arizona responded to a home where they found a 9-year-old girl deceased. She lived there with her mother Sandra, grandmother Elizabeth, and her 2 brothers. When the officers entered the home, they immediately noticed bugs covering the young girl's face. Investigators later confirmed that those bugs were head lice. They also stated that the home was very dirty and in a state of disarray. According to the medical examiner, the child had passed away due to anemia due to a lice infestation that had gone untreated for a long period of time. Just hours before the little girl had passed away, Sandra had texted her boyfriend saying, "Oh my god, babe, listen, my mom had called me while I was in the other room and she asked if I could check her pulse to make sure she wasn't dying." Sandra's boyfriend begged her to take her daughter to the hospital, but she never did. And about 2.5 hours later, the little girl passed away. Sandra later admitted that her daughter had been sick for a very long time. She had a fever, she was vomiting, struggling to breathe, and eventually she was too weak to even walk on her own. Sandra stated she knew if that she had gotten her daughter medical care, she would still be alive, but she didn't due to the lice infestation. Both Sandra and her mother Elizabeth were arrested and charged with child abuse and murder. Sandra was sentenced to 10 years in prison for manslaughter and probation for 10 years for 2 counts of child abuse. As for Elizabeth, she was given 7 years of probation and 100 hours of community service.
He completely vanished, but the TV in his room was still playing, and someone had come in and quietly deleted everything off his computer. It was November 2002 in beautiful Minnesota. Josh Guimond was a 20-year-old student at St. John's University. Now, he was a straight A student, super clever. Everybody knew that he was destined for great things. He was like, I'm going to go to law school, and everybody knew he could do it with his eyes closed. Like loads of students do at uni, he was living on campus with 5 roommates, including his best friend Nick. On the 9th of November, he was invited to a poker party, which sounds like my idea of heaven, in the Metten Court dormitory building, which was really convenient because it wasn't far away from his dorm. It was literally a maximum of 3 minutes walk from his front door. So he was like, perfect. And another reason why he was really excited for this party is that he'd broken up with his girlfriend, Katie. They were long term, but they decided to call it a day and just stay civil. But it was obviously pretty difficult for Josh, and he wanted something to take his mind off it. Josh headed over to the party, and it seemed like his spirits were lifted. He was having a great time. Now, witnesses vary in their accounts of what they feel like Josh was like that night. Some said, yeah, he was pretty sober, and other people were like, he seemed pretty wasted. But what they all agreed on was that he left the party at 11:45 p.m. alone. Pretty much everybody at the party just presumed that he'd gone to bed. They had no reason to think otherwise. He'd actually got a meeting scheduled the next day, so they were like, that makes sense. He obviously wants to get an early sleep. The next day in that meeting room, one chair sat empty, and that's when alarm bells rang. So his friends got onto campus security and they were like, this doesn't feel right, can you do a welfare check on this guy? So they went over to check his dorm, and at first they were like, this is good news, we can hear the TV on in his room. But then they realised nobody was watching that TV. It was just on, and Josh was nowhere to be found. Now, what was really unusual about this is that his car was still parked outside as normal, and all of his personal belongings were inside, so it wasn't like he'd gone anywhere of his own accord. Locals got together to hunt for Josh, and the water beneath a nearby bridge was even searched just in case he'd fallen in by accident on his walk home, but no luck. Police started interviewing all of the students, and it was a bit sketchy when they spoke to best friend Nick. He admitted to kissing Josh's ex, Katie, which obviously might not be relevant, but might be totally relevant. The night before, witnesses had also heard the 2 guys arguing, and police were like, okay, is this potentially a motive? Kate and Nick were even together the night that Josh vanished. Nick then went back to his dorm at 2:42 a.m. according to the electronic swipe key. Interestingly though, Josh's key was never used to re-enter the building. And weirdly, Nick and Katie's stories differ ever so slightly. Nick said that the pair had said their goodbyes around 2:30 a.m, but Katie said it was around an hour before. Nick also refused to take a lie detector test. I mean, personally, even if I was innocent, I would refuse because they're so unreliable, but it doesn't look good. And when police looked at Josh's computer, it sent a chill down their spines because after Josh had gone missing, somebody had deleted a load of items off his computer. Was it a roommate? Was it a randomer? Was it Josh himself? Like, what do you think? And what officers found elsewhere on that computer was really weird. It seemed like Josh, or somebody on Josh's computer, had been using online forums to chat with both males and females. So then they thought, well, has he maybe gone to meet somebody he met online? Another person of interest was identified, a really sketchy man who'd been loitering around campus in his car. And loads of witnesses had seen this guy. And when police spoke with him, he denied all knowledge, but then went on to get his car destroyed. Like, that doesn't feel like the actions of an innocent person. Police dogs were used to try and track Josh's scent, and the dogs led investigators to St. John's Abbey. Now, this is really interesting. This was the monastery on campus, but chillingly, they wouldn't let them in until they pretty much had no choice. Now, this could be linked because investigators found Josh was looking into abuse allegations made regarding monks and priests at St. John's University. Was this potentially a reason to delete things from his computer? Multiple people backed up these allegations, and in 2016, files were actually publicized of 18 monks that were accused of essaying children. One of those monks was in charge of supervising Josh's dormitory. But despite even Netflix covering this case on Unsolved Mysteries, it remains chillingly unsolved.
I can't believe that I had never heard of this case before. It took place in 2020 and the murder was absolutely sadistic and barbaric. A totally blameless victim who was murdered simply because she declined sexual advances from her housemate. She had the unthinkable done to her body, and the lengths that her killer went to try and conceal the crime, only to be caught red-handed, is absolutely unbelievable. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Phoenix Nets. In early 2020, 28-year-old Phoenix was living within a HMO property in the lovely Lozells, Birmingham. She was originally from London, however she decided to move up to Birmingham for a fresh start. She had struggled with addiction, and with the support from her loving family, she decided to make the move. She wanted to start fresh with a complete clean slate. And Phoenix was doing really well here. Her future started to look really promising and bright. Soon, Grace Gordon would move into that same house, and she and Phoenix would cross paths while in the communal areas of the house. The two quickly struck up a friendship, and they would sit talking in each of their bedrooms for hours and hours upon ends, sharing stories, laughing and chatting. This was the start of what could have been a really blossoming friendship, but Grace wanted more than that. She had made sexual advances towards Phoenix, which Phoenix was not interested and said no to. But that didn't stop Garisa. On one occasion, after yet again refusing her sexual advances, Garisa would push Phoenix around the bedroom and became really aggressive towards her. Where Phoenix had once considered to be safe and her home, she began living in a constant state of fear and anxiety. When the lockdown restrictions of 2020 came into place, I can only imagine that this heightened that feeling for Phoenix, because she was going to be stuck in the house with Garisa. This is when she would make the decision that she was going to move back down to London to be with her parents. When Phoenix told Garisa her plans, Garisa couldn't disguise the anger in her face. On the 16th of April 2020, Garisa would creep to Phoenix's room, knife in hand. She would pounce on the unsuspecting Phoenix, stabbing her 4 times in the torso. The wounds weren't immediately fatal, and if Garisa had contacted the emergency services, they would have likely been able to save her life, but she didn't do that. Instead, she sat with Phoenix for hours and hours upon end, while Phoenix was writhing and moaning in pain until she eventually succumbed to her injuries, dying. This could have taken up to 12 hours for her to bleed out. The next day, Garisa bought a circular saw off of Gumtree and proceeded to dismember Phoenix's body into 6 separate pieces. The dismembered remains would then be put into 2 suitcases. She would spend hours meticulously scrubbing the room from top to bottom. She was not wanting to leave a single trace of evidence behind, not a speck of blood or a bit of DNA. She would spend hours scrubbing, and she even got rid of some of the bloody furniture along with the bloody clothes. She had done that by actually hiring a rubbish disposal team to come to the house to collect the items. They took away Phoenix's bed, a blood-soaked carpet and some black bin bags. Meanwhile, no one had any idea what had happened to Phoenix. Garisa had taken her phone and she had studied exactly how Phoenix would text people, and she continued to text them back and forth pretending to be Phoenix so that no one had any idea that she was dead.
Using some voice notes that Phoenix had sent, Garisa would sit and she would take a couple of words from this voice note, take a couple of words from that voice note, and piece them all together to create new voice notes to send to people. She had meticulously studied Phoenix so well that while she was impersonating her, no one was any the wiser. With the help of a man named Mahesh, Garisa would transport Phoenix's remains from Birmingham to a dense, isolated, foresty area of Gloucestershire. Alongside the 2 suitcases that contained Phoenix's remains, Garisa also brought along a jerry can full of petrol, her Google searches only confirming what she was about to attempt. She wanted to burn Phoenix's remains all the way down to ash. As Garisa went into the woods and began the first steps of her plan, Mahesh, who was still in the car, started to just drive around the local area doing loops of different streets and houses. One person would notice his car on the roads because this was already a usually quiet area, but again, this is in the peak of COVID when people were supposed to be staying at home no matter what. This person noticed his car driving back and forth, and so they contacted the police to report him. Officers pulled Mahesh over and told him to go back home. They could see that his car was registered to over 80 miles away. They watched him pull away and then slowly drive towards a woman who was stood on the side of the road clutching 2 suitcases. Now this screamed suspicious, and so they called for backup. One set of the officers were dealing with Mahesh, while some other officers went to speak to who we now know was Garisa. She did not want to let them near the suitcases or let them look inside, and when they did, they would discover the burnt remains of Phoenix Nets. Both Garisa Gordon and Mahesh would be arrested. Mahesh would be acquitted of his charges as they couldn't prove that he knew what Garisa was doing, knew what she had in the suitcase, or knew what she had done. Garisa Gordon would plead guilty to murdering, dismembering, and then trying to dispose of Phoenix's remains. For this, she would be handed a sentence of life imprisonment with a minimum of 23.5 years to serve.
75 years ago in Northern California, a man was found dead on the beach wearing nothing but his socks and shoes. His clothes were neatly folded beside his body. But his girlfriend, who had been with him the night before, was nowhere to be found, and her clothes were neatly placed beneath his. So it was a little after 8 p.m. on Saturday, June 17th, 1950, when 17-year-old Barbara Kelly finished her shift at the Goody Cafe in Fortuna, California. Like most weekends, she already had plans to go out that night. Waiting outside to pick her up was her boyfriend Henry Baird, who everyone just referred to as Red. Barbara and Red had been dating for about 2 months at this point, and that evening they had plans to drive to Eureka, see a movie, and afterwards Barbara was supposed to spend the night at a friend's house. Now, I do want to take a minute to point out that there was a pretty big age gap between the two of them. So Red was 27 years old, nearly 10 years older than Barbara, who was set to turn 18 in August, and believe me, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking, and I agree, that kind of age gap is definitely concerning, especially since Barbara was still a minor for the next 2 months. But I do want to mention that this was 1950, and a lot of things back then were not viewed the same way they are today. I'm not making an excuse for it because no matter the decade, it's still very uncomfortable, but I just want to provide some context for the time. Anyway, despite the age gap, Barbara's family seemed to genuinely like Red. Her parents and siblings spoke very highly of him, and from what we know, they felt like he had a pretty solid reputation. He was a World War II veteran who had started working as a bakery truck driver, which is actually how he and Barbara first met. His delivery route brought him by the cafe regularly, and over time the two of them got to know each other. So now that we've got that out of the way, back to June 17th, 1950. Before heading out that evening, Barbara and Red stopped by her house where she let her younger sister know about her plans, left a note for her parents. It was just a typical Saturday night for Barbara, but unfortunately that would be the last time anyone in her family would see her again. That next morning, Sunday, June 18th, a fisherman and his son were walking along the beach just below the Table Bluff Lighthouse near Eureka when they stumbled upon a very gruesome scene. Lying face down in the sand was the body of 27-year-old Henry Baird. He had been shot once in the back of the head and was completely nude except for his socks and shoes. Just beside his body were his neatly folded clothes. His car was parked only yards away, its doors open, the keys still inside, but his .22 caliber pistol, which he was known to keep in his glove compartment, was missing. But even more alarming was the fact that Barbara, who had been with him the night before, was nowhere to be found. Police found all of her clothes, aside from her shoes and stockings, neatly piled beneath Red's. Even her purse was left behind, along with Red's wallet, which still had about $25 to $35 in it. That's the equivalent of around $300 to $400 today, so whatever happened, it was clear that robbery was not a motive. While investigators got to work processing the scene, Barbara's family was just going about their typical morning routine when two sheriff's deputies knocked on the door asking about Barbara's whereabouts. As you can probably imagine, they were shocked. This was the first time that her family learned she was missing, because remember, she was supposed to be spending the night with a friend in Eureka. They had no idea that she never made it to that friend's house. So with Barbara nowhere to be found and Red confirmed no longer alive, investigators were left trying to make sense of what actually happened here. And one of the earliest theories they considered was that Barbara had shot Red, either by accident or on purpose, using his own gun. Then they thought maybe she just walked into the ocean to take her own life by drowning. But the truth is, there really wasn't much evidence to support this theory aside from Red's missing pistol and a statement from one of the lighthouse attendants who said he only saw one car drive down to the beach shortly after midnight and he never saw it come back up. But this murder-suicide theory started to fall apart after 5 days of intensive searching along the coastline and in the water by both Civil Air Patrol planes and the Coast Guard turned up no trace of Barbara. And based on the tides in the area, experts believe that if she had drowned in the water, her body would have likely washed back to shore at this point, and her family also pointed out that Barbara had always been afraid of the ocean and wouldn't have willingly gone in. So with no evidence to support this idea that she was anywhere in the water and her family firmly believing that she was also a victim of foul play, investigators began to turn their focus to the possibility of a third person being involved, someone who killed Red and abducted Barbara and possibly murdered her somewhere else. This shift in direction was also supported by the autopsy results, which revealed details that didn't match the initial assumption about the murder weapon. So Red's autopsy showed severe skull damage that didn't match the small caliber bullet that would have come from his pistol. In fact, the skull damage was so significant that at first glance, it was believed he might have been hit with an object before being shot, but this was proven to be false when fragments of a copper-jacketed explosive-type bullet were found, which shattered on impact and caused that significant damage. Unfortunately, because the bullet broke apart, ballistics couldn't determine its exact size, but investigators believed it was not fired from Red's pistol. And for those who may be wondering, the reason the lighthouse attendants didn't report the gunshot was because the ocean waves were so loud it drowned out any possible noise. They simply just didn't hear it. This is one of those cases where police just didn't have a lot to go on. In 1963, so 13 years later, 46-year-old Gail Patrick Irish, a convicted sex offender serving time at the California men's colony, suddenly confessed to killing both Red and Barbara. Gail said that in the early morning hours of Sunday, June 18th, 1950, he was driving around the Table Bluff area when he came across Red and Barbara in their car. He said he forced them out at gunpoint using a pistol, made them strip naked, shot Red, then abducted and sexually assaulted Barbara before driving her several miles away to a remote logging road where he killed her and buried her in a shallow grave. He even had information about the case that had never been made public, stuff that only investigators and the killer would know. Even with the level of detail in his confession, investigators were still hesitant. They needed more than just his word, especially in a case that had gone unsolved for over a decade. So unless Gail could lead them to Barbara's body or provide some kind of physical evidence, they were hesitant to just take his word for it. However, Gail did agree to help and was flown to Humboldt County to try and locate the burial site, but after searching dozens of locations, he couldn't find the exact spot. He then changed his story, saying he used a rifle instead of a pistol. He said he ordered the couple out of the car, made Henry lie face down in the sand before killing him, then forced Barbara into his car. He drove her to a remote logging road and shot her, but he said he didn't bury her like he had planned to because a pickup truck passed by and briefly stopped, which spooked him. So he left Barbara's body behind a large log where it wouldn't be visible from the road, went back to Eureka, and 2 months later he returned to the site, said the logs had been moved, but he didn't actually get out of his car. I think it's also worth noting that this remote area had changed a lot over the past 13 years, with 2 of the buildings Gail said he remembered no longer being there, which could have made it difficult for him to lead investigators to the exact site. But investigators were not ready to give up, so they took Gail to the beach where Red was found, hoping he could recreate the events and remember where he drove Barbara, and while he was there, he drew a diagram of the murder, which investigators said matched how the crime likely happened. The investigators really began to believe Gail's confession. They thought that he had done it because they said he had too much first-hand knowledge of the case to not have been involved. But at the same time, deputies were still trying to track down this rifle Gail claimed he used during the murders, and it was confirmed that he did own a rifle at one point, but after he was arrested in 1951 for sexually assaulting a minor, that gun was confiscated by police and possibly dumped in Humboldt Bay. I guess it wasn't uncommon for police to destroy seized firearms by throwing them into large bodies of water, and at the time, Gail wasn't considered a suspect in any murder, so there was no reason to preserve the weapon. Unfortunately, that meant there was no way to recover the rifle and no way to test whether it had actually been used in the crime. But there was a possible break in the case when 3 children came forward and told deputies deputies that they had come across some bones while hiking in the area 3 years earlier. They sat down on a log to rest when they looked over and saw some bones, one of which still had a wristwatch on it. And the location where they made this discovery happened to match the site Gail claimed he killed and left Barbara. Now, when the kids found the bones, they told their parents. They chalked it up to a wild imagination and didn't report it until 3 years later. The children did lead deputies back to the spot, which did align with Gail's original description, but by then it was too late. There were no bones and no wristwatch to be found. But just because it was worth asking, a deputy followed up with Barbara's sister, who confirmed that Barbara had been wearing a wristwatch the night she disappeared, and it was a gift the sister had actually given to her. But unfortunately, that watch was never found, and without Barbara's body, without the murder weapon, and without any real solid evidence to back up Gail's story beyond the details he knew that hadn't been made public, his confession just wasn't enough, and he wasn't charged with the murders. But Red and Barbara's case wasn't the only one Gail confessed to. He also claimed responsibility for the 1957 killing of 21-year-old Bill Wells Hale, who was shot in the head while parked on a quiet road in Yuba County with a 25-year-old woman named Patricia who survived the attack. According to Patricia, she and Bill were parked on a quiet road late one night in July when another car pulled up. A man got out with a rifle, told Bill to get out of the car, turn off the headlights, and then shot him in the head before he even had a chance to move the switch. And that bullet actually shattered on impact. That man then abducted Patricia, drove her to a rural home, and threatened her with a razor blade. He tied her at hands and seemed like he was preparing to sexually assault her, but the family who lived at that house returned home just in time, and Patricia managed to break free and jump out of the car. The man got away, the case went cold, but then Gail later confessed to it. He gave specific details about the crime that hadn't been made public. He provided an accurate reconstruction of the crime scene. And even though it had been several years since the attack, Patricia was brought in and picked two men from a lineup, one of them being Gail, and when Gail was asked to identify her in a lineup, he picked two women, one of them being Patricia. But once again, much like Red and Barbara's case, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him, and records show he died in 1984. So he was never charged with any of the murders. The only crimes he was ever charged and convicted of were a long history of sex crimes, some of which were committed against children. This year marks 75 years since the disappearance of 17-year-old Barbara Kelly and the murder of 27-year-old Henry Red Baird. Both cases are still unsolved, and no arrests have ever been made in connection with their cases, which means that if you have any information or know anyone who might have information, you are strongly encouraged to call the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office at 707-268-2539. If you have made it to the end of this video, I just want to take a moment to say thank you. It's so important to keep talking about these unsolved cases no matter how much time has passed, because every victim and every family deserves to have justice. That said, please remember to be kind and respectful in the comments. This is someone's real life. Again, thank you so much for being here, and I will see you in my next video.
A 91-year-old woman sadistically tortured to death in her own home. This case is as horrific as it sounds, so please be warned before watching. I'm True Crime Caitlin, and this is the murder of Nellie Hawcutt. In mid-January 2003, neighbours on the Williamsbridge neighbourhood in the Bronx, New York, noticed something that was out of the ordinary, and they started to grow concerned. Their 91-year-old neighbour Nellie hadn't pulled her car off her driveway into her garage for a couple of days, or emptied her letterbox. Her post was piling up, and both of these things were completely out of the ordinary. When no one was able to contact or get in touch or set eyes on Nellie, the neighbours contacted the police asking them to go in and check on her. The officers would soon arrive to Nellie's home, and what they would discover was the most traumatic scene. Nellie was originally from Atlanta, Georgia, however at some point in her life moved from the south over to the Bronx in New York, where she at one point was a Girl Scouts leader. Nellie was the staple, the backbone of her neighbourhood. She was the type of person who would bring your bins out for you, put them back in, she would collect your post for you. She was everyone's nana. People would always go to her for advice and for guidance, and she was the biggest cheerleader to all of the children in the neighbourhood, all of which were her grandchildren. Not really, but like they were. She was this grandmother figure, and she treated all of the children with love like she would her own grandchildren. She would make sure that the children were focusing on their education. She taught them proper etiquette. She was very well known for her generosity, kindness, and her activism. Despite her age being 91 years old, Nellie was still very independent. She looked after herself, she was self-sufficient, and would drive herself to church every single Sunday. When the officers walked into her house, they would find Nellie bound to a chair with telephone cord and duct tape. She had a rag shoved into her mouth and a plastic bag over her head. The bag was fastened tightly to her head with one of her own scarves. It was later determined that she had suffocated to death, this plastic bag being put over her head while she was still alive. Surrounding the chair that Nellie was found in, there was bottles of alcohol, and later testing would show that Nellie had ingested red wine, scotch and rubbing alcohol, all of which were forced into her mouth, and they were able to tell this because she had lacerations on her tongue. Bruising on Nellie's legs showed that she had tried to fight off her attacker, but she was overpowered. At the scene, it was determined that there was no sign of forced entry. All of the items that were used for the torture and the killing were from inside of Nellie's house, so the plastic bag and the telephone cord, for example. So the killer hadn't come prepared. Had the killer arrived to Nellie's house with the intention of committing murder, or was this just a crime of opportunity? The crime scene investigators were able to lift some foreign fingerprints that they found interesting from inside of Nellie's house, and they would use this to compare to people to rule them out as suspects. An investigation into the torture and murder of Nellie Horcutt ensued, and the investigators spoke to everyone that they could. Nellie's entire family, extended family, boyfriends, friends. They were at one point even suspicious about Nellie's postman, but none of their fingerprints matched what they discovered inside of Nellie's house. From speaking to people, they would learn that she was very security conscious and she wouldn't let just anyone into her house, so she must have known her killer. After conducting all of these interviews and doing what they could, with nothing else to go off, the investigation into Nellie's murder went cold. Nellie's family and detectives had to wait 4 agonisingly long years until a tip finally came in, giving the investigators their big break. A woman named Larissa had approached the police and told them that she knew of 2 girls. These 2 girls had confided in her that they had committed a murder of an elderly woman in the Bronx, and it was Nellie. Larissa named both of the girls as Sparkle Daniel and Nadine Panton. Larissa had known about their involvement, I'm not sure how long for, but she was only coming forward to the police at this stage because she and Sparkle were in an argument, a fight over a man. So this was more like a revenge report. I guess Larissa thought if Sparkle went to prison, she could have that man all to herself. Sparkle was arrested in 2007, and when her fingerprints were compared to what was left behind in Nellie's house, they were a match. She confessed that yes, she was in the house that day and she was there when the torture and murder took place, but it was all Nadine and she was terrified of Nadine. Nadine had then made threats towards her. When questioned, Nadine wouldn't deny her involvement in the murder, but she tried to pin most of the blame on Sparkle. So what happened on the day of the murder? It was the 10th of January 2003 and Nellie had been out to get a little bit of food shopping. She was carrying her shopping bags back into the house when Sparkle offered to help her. She was 17 at the time and 26-year-old Nadine was also with her. The girls would help Nellie into the house with the shopping bags, and like I said earlier, Nellie was very security conscious. But she knew Sparkle. She was actually really close with Sparkle's auntie, and so she was very familiar with Sparkle, and Sparkle was someone that she trusted. Once the girls were inside of Nellie's house, Sparkle asked if she could use Nellie's phone to ring her auntie, and Nellie said, of course. When she couldn't get through to her auntie, however, this is when Sparkle said that Nadine turned around and said that they were going to rob Nellie. And so they began rummaging around Nellie's house, her bag, her purse, and it was only partway through that they had the realisation, Nellie knows who we are. She knew their names and their faces, and she could and likely would report them to the police and get them arrested. But they weren't going to let that happen. And that is when they sadistically tortured and murdered 91-year-old Nellie, forcing alcohol down her throat, binding her to a chair, stuffing her mouth with a rag, and suffocating her with a plastic bag. Sparkle Daniel and Nadine Panton were both convicted for the charges brought against them for Nellie's murder. Sparkle was handed a sentence of 25 years imprisonment, and Nadine was handed a sentence of 25 to life.
A little girl disappears on her way to school, but where she was the whole time is honestly worse than what anyone could have imagined. So her name is Jessica Ridgway. She's only 10 years old, living with her mom in a small town in Colorado Colorado called Westminster. And on the morning of October 5th, 2012, Jessica is standing at her doorway of her home about to get ready to walk to her friend's house so that they could head to school together. And we'll call this friend Kevin. So at around 8 a.m., she hugs her mom, Sarah, goodbye. She grabs her purple glasses, throws on her backpack, and walks straight out the front door. Now, it's super cold outside. Like, the snow is starting to fall, but Jessica doesn't really mind because this walk to Kevin's house is only about like 4 minutes away. But what Jessica doesn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known, is that as she's walking down the street, a very, very dangerous creature is watching her. Meanwhile, just a few houses down, Kevin is sitting at his windowsill and he's looking out at the snow and he's starting to notice how heavy it's getting. He really doesn't feel like walking to school in this weather. So he turns to his dad and he's like, hey, can you drive me and Jessica to school? She's walking here right now. And so his dad looks outside and he sees the snow coming down harder and he agrees without hesitation. He's like, yeah, sure, we'll wait for her and then I'll take both of you guys. So they wait and wait and wait, but oddly, Jessica never shows up. Now, Kevin's dad is checking his watch and he's realizing that school quite literally starts in less than 10 minutes. And if he doesn't leave anytime soon, then Kevin will be late. So he turns to Kevin and he says, look, we cannot wait any longer. Maybe her mom ended up driving her. Let's just go. So they leave, assuming that everything is fine. But when Kevin gets to school, he immediately starts looking around for Jessica. He's checking the hallways, scanning the cafeteria, looking for her everywhere, but still she's nowhere to be found. And when the bell rings for homeroom and the teacher starts doing roll call, just going down the list of names one by one, when she gets to Jessica's name and calls it out, there's only silence. Now, this isn't normal. Like, Jessica is never absent without some sort of note from her mom. So her teacher very quickly marks her absence and sends the note down to the front office, who immediately starts trying to call Sarah to figure out what is going on. The phone rings and rings and rings, but nobody is answering. And here's the problem. The reason that Sarah isn't picking up the phone is because she works night shift at her job, which means that her entire sleeping schedule is completely flipped. Like, when most people are waking up at 7 a.m. and getting ready for their day, that's exactly when Sarah is coming home from work and going straight to bed. Which meant that while the school was calling her, Sarah was sound asleep, completely unaware that her daughter was going through the most horrific, terrifying experience that no child should ever go through. Because when Jessica left her house that morning and started walking down the sidewalk towards Kevin's house, she probably noticed this really nice looking Jeep parked on the side of the road, which didn't really seem unusual or suspicious because, I mean, hello, cars park all the time on the street in her neighborhood. So she probably didn't even think about it, didn't even give it a second glance. But what Jessica didn't know is that the creature inside that Jeep was staring directly at her, watching her every move, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that creature's name is Austin Sigg. He's only 17 years old and he has been sitting in this car for who knows how long, just waiting, planning, obsessing over this exact moment for weeks, maybe even months. You see, Austin wasn't some random predator who just happened to be driving through the neighborhood that morning. No, he lived just 1 mile away from Jessica's house, which meant that he knew this area inside and out. He knew the route that kids would take to school. He knew what time they would leave their houses, and he knew when their parents weren't watching. And for months leading up to this exact morning, Austin has been consumed by these dark, incredibly disturbing fantasies about abduction and control and murder, spending hours and hours researching serial killers online, studying how they operated, learning about dismemberment and how to get away with taking someone's life. And even more disturbing is that he is enrolled in mortuary science classes, and I'm probably not saying it right, but just know he's literally being taught how to handle dead bodies, how to preserve them, how to cut into them. And his poor mom, thinking that he was just being a dedicated student who was serious about his future career, would even let him practice tying people up with zip ties at home, thinking that it was for his crime classes, having absolutely no idea that her son was not preparing for a career. He was preparing for this exact morning, the day that he hunts down Jessica. So when Jessica walked past his Jeep, when she got just close enough that he could reach her, Austin didn't hesitate, not even for a second. He bolted out of his car, ran up behind her before she could even have time to turn around, and wrapped his arms around her small body, lifting her completely completely off the ground. And as this stranger is now holding onto her, Jessica starts screaming, probably trying to kick him to get away from whoever is holding her. But she's only 10 years old and Austin is 17 and so much bigger and stronger than her. So pretty quickly, he overpowers her, carries her to his Jeep, and throws her into the backseat like she's nothing. The impact is so hard that it probably knocked the wind out of her for a second, and before she can even catch her breath to scream for help, Austin slams the door shut and the whole car shakes. He then pulls out a pack of zip ties, probably the same ones that he was using to practice with at home, and he grabs Jessica's wrists and he wraps the plastic so tight around her that it digs into her skin, binding her ankles and her hands together so that she can't fight back or try to open the door and escape. And Jessica, this little girl, while all of this is happening, is so scared, so completely and utterly terrified beyond anything that she has ever experienced in her entire life, that she loses control of her bladder right there in the back seat and she wets herself. And now on top of everything else that she's feeling, she's probably also feeling humiliated and scared and thinking, no, this cannot actually be happening right now. And as she sits there shaking and crying, and I applaud her courage for this, Jessica starts screaming at him, "Who are you? What are you going to do to me? Why are you doing this?" But Austin just looks down at her with this scary, calm expression on his face and says, almost gently, like he's trying to comfort her, "Don't worry, I promise you'll be okay. Nothing bad will happen to you. You're safe." "Sir, you have her zip tied in the back of your car. What do you mean nothing bad will happen? This is already the worst thing that could have happened to her." And within just a few minutes, he is already pulling into his driveway because, like I said earlier, he literally lives 1 mile away from Jessica's house. He then quickly drags Jessica out of the car, probably covering her mouth or something so that she can't scream, and very quietly brings her inside the house and into his bedroom, where he then shuts the door behind them. That truly must have felt like the end of the world for her, knowing that there was nothing you could do to free yourself. And once she is in his possession, this is where everything Austin does becomes even more twisted, even more calculated, and just straight up sickening. Because instead of immediately hurting her, instead of showing his true intentions right away, Austin sits Jessica down on his bed like they're just gonna hang out like normal teenagers. He then walks over to his TV and turns it on to some cartoon or kids show, and then he looks at Jessica with this calm expression and says in a reassuring voice, "See, you're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you. Everything's going to be okay. You can just relax and watch TV." He even goes to his own dresser and pulls out one of his own shirts and hands it to Jessica, telling her that she can change out of her wet clothes because they're soaked in urine and probably uncomfortable. And he's acting like he's being considerate, like he's being kind to her, like he genuinely cares for her comfort. But this isn't kindness at all. This isn't even compassion. This is a game that Austin is playing. This is him being deliberately manipulative and cruel because he wants Jessica to let her guard down. He wants her to trust him just a little bit. He wants her to think that maybe this isn't as bad as she thought. Maybe he won't really hurt her and he'll just let her go soon. But eventually, Austin's fake mask comes off. He completely stops pretending being this nice teenage boy who just wants to keep her safe and watch cartoons with her. And what happens next, I need to warn you that this is going to be really difficult to hear, is that Austin assaults her probably multiple times. And when he's done with her, he decides that he's going to end her life. First, he tries using zip ties, taking a fresh one out from his collection and wrapping it around Jessica's neck and pulling it as tightly as he possibly can. But as he's trying to squeeze as hard as he can, he starts to realize that zip ties aren't really working the way that he thought they would. There just isn't enough force behind it. Hey, dumbass, maybe that's a sign to, I don't know, stop. But does he stop? No. Instead, he decides to use his bare hands. He wraps them around Jessica's neck and he starts squeezing even harder than he did before. And he holds it there with this firm death grip for like 3 minutes until eventually her body just goes limp. But even after all of that, even after for so long that his own hands are cramping and tired. When Austin finally lets go and looks down at Jessica, he notices something that makes him frustrated. Jessica is somehow still breathing. I mean, it's barely just these shallow little breaths, but she's still showing signs of life. And I wish so desperately that in this moment, some part of Austin's little brain had kicked in and told him to stop. But that is not what happened. Monsters like him just don't have a heart. Instead, Austin gets up and he walks into the bathroom and he turns on the faucet for the bathtub and he starts filling it up with hot water. And when the tub is full enough, when there's enough water to completely cover a person's head, Austin walks back to the bedroom and he grabs Jessica by her head and drags her across the floor into the bathroom. And Jessica's eyes probably fluttered just for a second as she feels herself being moved, like that survival instinct that maybe, just for a moment, there is this glimmer of hope that he changes his mind. Maybe he's actually gonna help her and this is going to end. But then Austin lifts her up and forces her face first into the bathtub, plunging her head straight under the water. And Jessica is probably fighting for her life, trying desperately to grab onto like the side of the tub to pull herself up. But Austin, this evil creature, is standing over her with his hands pressed firmly on the back of her head, using his entire body weight to hold her down until eventually her body sadly goes completely still. And now Jessica Ridgway, the girl who woke up this morning excited to see her friends at school, the girl who hugged her mom not even a few hours ago, the girl who had all of these dreams and plans and a whole life ahead of her, is gone. But even with all of that pain that Austin just caused her, this vile creature isn't done with her. He's not even finished. Because while Jessica's body is still floating motionless in this bathtub with her face still submerged in the water, Austin very calmly walks out of the bathroom and gets his hands on a saw. Yes, a freaking saw. Like the thing that you would use for cutting wood or working on construction projects. And he begins dismembering her, using everything that he learned in his mortuary science class about how to body without making mistakes. Now, while all of this is going on, back at Jessica's house, Sarah is finally waking up. It's now 4 p.m. and she's been asleep for like hours and she's probably expecting for Jessica to be home already. But as you already know, Jessica is nowhere near the house. And when Sarah grabs her phone, maybe to check if Jessica texted her, she sees several missed calls from the school. And immediately, like instantly, her stomach drops and she can feel it in her bones that something really bad has happened. So she calls the school back and that's when they tell her the news that every single parent dreads hearing more than anything else in the world. Jessica never made it to school this morning. Now Sarah's brain probably tries to reject this information at first, right? Like finding some type of logical explanation that isn't absolutely terrifying. She's probably thinking, okay, this has to be a mistake. Maybe they forgot to mark her attendance or something. It happens all the time. But the school confirms it. Jessica definitely never arrived. But she couldn't find her anywhere. So rather than wasting more precious time, Sarah grabs her phone with her hands probably trembling from how anxious she is and she dials 911. And within minutes, literally just minutes, police are pulling up in front of Sarah's house with these lights flashing really bright and officers are spreading out across the neighborhood, knocking on every single door asking if anyone saw anything unusual that morning. But no one heard or saw Jessica's screams for help that morning. No one. So for the rest of the entire day, even though officers issued an Amber Alert, even though Jessica's face was everywhere, no one knew that she was already gone. And it wasn't until 2 days later, a man, for story purposes we'll call Joe, is outside taking a walk around the neighborhood on a Sunday afternoon when something on the sidewalk catches his eye. And it's a black backpack just sitting there in the middle of the sidewalk like someone deliberately placed it there. And Joe's thinking, okay, this is kind of weird. Something about this doesn't feel right. And he looks around to see if there's anyone nearby, but the street is completely empty. And with everything going on with Jessica's disappearance, with the Amber Alerts and the search parties and police everywhere, Joe honestly did not want to take any chances. So he pulls out his phone and he calls 911. And he's like, hey, there's this really suspicious bag here on the sidewalk near my house. Y'all should come and check this out like ASAP. And within minutes, police officers arrive to the scene and they approach the bag very cautiously, treating it like it might be evidence. And when they carefully unzip it and start looking inside, what they find makes their heart stop. First was a child's t-shirt completely soaked in urine, and then there was a pair of pants also wet, and a water bottle. And then, and this is when they know, a pair of purple framed glasses, the same purple glasses that Jessica was wearing when she left her house. And the last item that they pull is a keychain with the name Jessica written on it in colorful letters. The officers all look at each other, and you can tell in their faces they know this is definitely Jessica Ridgway's backpack, which clearly means that something really, really bad happened to her. Someone kidnapped her. But the question still remained. Who? Now, you and I obviously already know the answer to that question, but neither the officers or Sarah know that Austin, this 17-year-old boy who lives just 1 mile down the road, already kidnapped Jessica and killed her. And after taking her life, Austin quickly realizes, oh crap, this is a problem. Like, I've made a huge mess here and my mom's coming home soon. And as he's probably pacing back and forth thinking, oh my god, where do I put her? Where do I hide this? That's when this genius over here decides to just shove Jessica's body parts into this crawl space under his house. Real smart, Austin. You really thought that went through, didn't you? And at some point, Austin either sees the news or maybe an officer knocking on his door asking about Jessica, and he realizes that people are actually looking for this girl. And so now he knows it's only a matter of time before he actually gets caught. So either late that night or early morning on Sunday, he decides to grab Jessica's backpack along with her urine-soaked clothes and drive about 6-7 miles away to this random neighborhood and just place her bag there. I'm guessing he thought that if investigators found her bag there, then they would stop searching in his neighborhood and start searching somewhere else instead. Like, oh my god, I hate whenever these idiots think that they're so smart. Anywho, fast forward to about a week after Jessica disappeared, and no one, not her mom, not the cops, has any idea that they're never going to find Jessica alive. And I could imagine that by this point, Austin is probably feeling really confident. I mean, he still hasn't been caught, right? But I also think that this confidence is actually slowly fading away, because as investigators start bringing out helicopters and more search dogs, as these search parties keep growing and growing and growing, I can only imagine how stressful that must be. Austin, feeling a little nervous there, buddy? And he's probably over here sitting in his room thinking, oh my god, I still have a decomposing body in my crawl space. At some point, my room's gonna start stinking and my mom might smell it. And so he comes up with yet another brilliant idea. I'll just get rid of some of the parts. And that's exactly what he does. He grabs some of Jessica's remains and puts them inside of this black garbage bag. And then he drives to this isolated field in Arvada, about 7 miles away from Jessica's home, looking for where he can dump them at. And he ends up finding this spot like near a culvert, and he checks to make sure that no one's watching. And then he just leaves the bag there like it's regular trash. Then he drives home, probably thinking that he just covered his tracks, probably feeling like he just outsmarted everyone. But spoiler alert, he didn't. Because 3 days later, on October 10th, 5 days after Jessica disappeared, some maintenance workers are working out in that exact field doing their regular rounds, picking up trash. And one of them spots this black bag near the culvert. And he's probably thinking, okay, this is just regular trash. So he plans on walking over there to toss it into his truck. But when he lifts the bag, he immediately notices that it's way heavier than it should be. And there is this awful stench coming from it. So he sets it back down and he opens it. And I don't know why he did that, but he did. And what he finds makes him stumble backwards so fast that he almost falls. And I'm not even gonna go into all of the gory details because it is genuinely horrific, and I honestly don't think that any of us need this image in our heads. And so eventually police arrive and they secure the area, and they carefully collect the remains and rush them to the coroner's office. And they pretty quickly figure out that these remains 100% belong to Jessica Ridgway. So now these investigators, some of whom are parents themselves, are sitting here in this room. Some of them are bawling their eyes out because now they have to try to figure out a way to make this horrible phone call to Sarah. They have to tell this mother that her little girl is never walking through her front door again, never going to give her another hug, never going to grow up and go to college and get married and have her own kids. All of that is gone now because of one evil teenager. Now at this point, no one still has any idea who could have done all this. All they knew is that from the DNA evidence that they collected is that the perpetrator is a male. That's it. But then one afternoon, so about 2 weeks after finding that bag, a mother calls 911. And she sounds really distressed, but she takes one deep breath and says this.
Hi, I need you to come to my house. My son wants to turn himself in for the Jessica Ridgway murder.
So it turns out that for reasons that I don't fully understand, maybe Austin felt that investigators were like closing in on him. Maybe the guilt was eating him alive. Who knows? But he woke up one day and very anxiously walked over to his mom, Mindy, and said, "Mom, I have something horrible to tell you." And his mom, probably feeling like her entire world started to crumble, immediately asks what's wrong. And that's when Austin confesses everything. How he took Jessica, how he killed her, how he cut into her body in their bathtub, and how he put her pieces in their crawl space. And as you can imagine, Mindy's jaw absolutely hit the freaking floor. Like, imagine hearing that your own son, your own child, confesses that he did something so unspeakably evil to a little girl. Like, what do you even do in that moment? Is there a guidebook called What to Do When Your Son Becomes an Absolute Monster? But despite her feelings, despite the fact that that's her son, Mindy knew exactly what she had to do. She knew that her son had gone way too far and that she did not want him to hurt anyone else. And so the mother that called 911 that afternoon, turning her son in, was Mindy. And as she continued explaining to the dispatcher how her son did it, she said the sentence, "Her remains are in my house." That's not a sentence that you would ever expect to say, you know? Eventually, Mindy passes the phone to Austin and he starts saying, "I did it. I murdered Ridgway. You have to send a squad car here, like now. I'm confessing." And so police speed to Mindy's house with the lights flashing and the sirens wailing. I mean, you can imagine. And when they get there and they start searching, everything is exactly where Austin said it would be. The tools that he used, the cleaning supplies, pieces of Jessica's remains hidden in the crawl space, everything confirming that this innocent little girl was right here in this house while his mom was at work, completely unaware. Officers immediately cuff him. Good, now keep it like that. And he is taken into custody and brought to the station where he sits for a 6-hour confession, just laying out every single horrific detail. And when investigators ask him why would you do something like this, something so horrific to a child, Austin looks at them and he says, and this is a direct quote by the way, "I wanted to see what it felt like. I was fulfilling a sexual fantasy. I wanted to know if I could actually go through with killing someone." What? Okay guys, I'm done. Keep him locked up, please. Austin got tried as an adult and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Oh my god, why am I so obsessed with that sentence? Let me say it again. Without the possibility of parole, which means that he will die behind bars. He will never breathe fresh air again, and he will never see the outside world. And honestly, some people would argue that that's not nearly harsh enough for what he did. But what do you guys think? And listen, I know that this one was a heavy one. It absolutely destroyed me while I was researching and writing this. But I think that it is most important that we remember Jessica, not as a victim, but as a person who was loved and had so many dreams and deserved an amazing life. Every year on what would have been her birthday, Sarah actually releases these purple balloons into the sky to honor her daughter's memory. And I think that's beautiful. So if you made it this far, then maybe if you want, drop a purple heart in the comments. And if her mom or a family member ever sees this, then they know that Jessica will always be loved and remembered. I love you guys. Mwah, group hug.
He could have gotten away with murder and it would look like an accident, but because he was so greedy, they found evidence that it was not in fact an accident. This is Ed and Julie Post, and they got married in 1967, and they have 2 daughters, and they moved to New Orleans, and they both work in real estate. In 1986, Ed and Julie attend a real estate convention in St. Louis, and they are staying at the Omni Hotel at Union Station. So on June 3rd, Ed decided to go for a jog before the convention. He woke up about 7 a.m. and was going to leave for his jog, but he woke Julie up before he left and drew her a bath. Ed finished his jog roughly about 7:40 and arrived back at the hotel, and when he got to his room, he found Julie face down and unconscious in the bathtub. So he pulled her out of the tub and called 911. Julie was pronounced dead at the hospital at only the age of 39, and they believed what happened is that she slipped and fell in the tub, and she tried to hold onto the towel ring that was in the shower, but it broke off the wall. Now, her husband, Ed, is trying to sue the hotel for that towel ring because if it would have stayed on the wall, she would have been able to hold herself and not have drowned. The autopsy showed that Julie had no narcotics or alcohol in her system. She had no skull fractures or bleeding on her brain. There was no evidence of foul play, but they still ruled her death undetermined, so they cannot confirm if this was an accident or if this was homicide. The DA's office had read Julie's story, and they're thinking, something's not right here. So they had a man who's roughly about 220 pounds hold all of his weight on that towel ring, and that towel ring did not budge whatsoever. According to Ed, him and Julie had a very good marriage, but they found out just a month prior to her passing, he had upped her life insurance to where he would get about $500,000 to $700,000. He also fancied a woman in his office named Kim Otan, but she is married. And at his own wife's funeral, he asked Kim, once this is all over, do you think you can set me up with your twin sister? How inappropriate is this? Also, what was very suspicious is that Ed's story never changed once about how he found his wife's body, almost like it was rehearsed. The workers at the hotel also said that Ed was acting very strangely that morning, so he made sure that he talked to the concierge that morning, make sure she knows him by name, and was thanking her for helping him from a favor the day before. Also, he mentioned to the doorman who he was, what hotel room he's staying in, and making sure that the doorman knows he's going for a jog and he'll be gone about 30 to 40 minutes. Why does he need to tell everybody who he is and what he's doing? He's trying to provide his alibi. They decided to exhume Julie's body for a second autopsy, and they found bruising on her that was not found in the first autopsy, but this is not uncommon. But Ed's defense is going to say, this is nothing. The bruising could have been from them removing her organs for donation. But where they found the bruising was on the back of her head near her neck, almost like a hand and thumbprint, like someone was taking her head and putting it into the water, drowning her. The towel ring is attached to metal studs inside the wall that are about 1/2 inch thick that can hold hundreds of pounds of force. So they decided to have a woman named Kelsey who's about the same height and weight as Julie, and you can see here, she's holding all of her weight on that metal ring and it's not budging whatsoever. She was also holding onto that ring and trying to turn it, from left to right to see if it would come out of the wall, and it still would not budge. So then they tell Kelsey to use both hands and just try to jiggle that towel ring out of the wall, and it took quite a bit of period of time for her to pull that out of the wall. There is no way that Julie pulled this towel ring from the wall. They did a test to see how much force it would take to pull this towel ring out of the wall. It takes about 480 to 500 pounds of force. So someone had pulled this towel ring from outside of the tub. It was someone who was very strong and probably used their foot to hold it up against the tub and then pull that metal ring out of the wall. People who knew Ed and Julie said that they often fought a lot and sometimes it got physical. Also, Ed was making advances towards Kim, who worked in his office, way before his wife's passing. 3 years after his wife's passing, Ed is on trial for first-degree homicide. Now, he did take the stand in his own defense, but people who witnessed his testimony said when he was on the stand, he was dressed very nicely. He didn't even have an accent. Even though he's from New Orleans, he talked like he was so proper and very intelligent. He also seemed very condescending. So Ed was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But he decided to appeal, and he said, I will plead guilty to second-degree homicide if I get a linear sentence and get 30 years with a possibility of parole. So it was approved, and he was paroled in the year 2014 at the age of 69. Ed had this all planned out and thought he was going to get away with it. He would have if he wouldn't have pulled that towel ring from the wall. That's what put the nail in his coffin, because it proves that there's no way she pulled it from the wall, because it's supposed to hold a lot of weight. It takes a lot of force to pull that out of the wall. But because he was so greedy, he decided to put it in the tub, but that put the nail in his coffin. Now, unfortunately, he's out on parole, but I believe he should have gotten life in prison, and they should have never given him that appeal and given him a chance at parole. But let me know what you guys thought of this. Thanks for watching. I love you all. We'll see you in the next one, and please take care of yourselves.